Very well then, I think we're now ready to begin our session, our meeting. To let you know that we have a simultaneous interpretation. Those of you who may wish to use it, you can select the language of your preference. We have English, Portuguese, and Spanish. Those who don't need any of the interpretation, you can leave it in off. And those who require any of the languages, you can just go ahead and choose the channel of your preference now, in keeping with the language of the presentation and whatever your personal needs may be. I will directly move on and yield the floor. The head of the Medication Unit and Sanitation Technology in the Department of Healthcare Systems, PAHO, Dr. Analia Porras. Analia, thank you so very much. I yield the floor to you for your opening remarks. Go ahead. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, to this 10th meeting of regulatory authorities for the strengthening of the regulatory capability of medical devices in the Americas. For me, it is truly a great pleasure to welcome you all to this meeting, which I think is a true point of reference. It's 10 years today of the establishment of the regulations of medical devices establishment. In 2012, it started with the participation of 12 regulatory authorities. And now we have 25 countries that actually participate in this very active group. It is likewise a very especially important year as far as regulations and for medical devices. In particular, next month, the Executive Committee of PAHO will be examining proposal of a document and the resolution for the strengthening of the regulatory systems for medications and other sanitation technologies. If approved by the committee, then the Pan American Scientific Conference that will be held in September will submit it for decision by the ministers. This tells us that 12 years ago, when the countries adopted the actual resolution CD 50R9, which was the first of its nature, the strengthening of the regulatory systems on a worldwide basis, but which only dealt with the regulation of medications, both biological as well as pharmaceutical. Today, it incorporates the priority of countries in the region when we adopt this document, of course, of the medical devices as a priority of public health and the regulation. In the last few years, suffice it to say that the regulation of these medical devices has been prioritized in many of our networks and fora, especially the PARF network, which adopted a permanent project on this topic since 2014, has been working on the regulation of these medical devices. PAHO today has also has been recognized since 2014 as an institution affiliated to the IMRDF, the status which allows it to represent countries in the region who are not members of the IMRDF in such form, which has promoted the establishment of working groups on a regional basis, the development of joint activities, dissemination of documents, as well as participation by the regulatory authorities in the region and the technical groups of the IMRDF. An example of the success of these groups is the program for the exchange of reports of medical devices in the Americas, known REDFA, which was begun with the RMDF group in the CAR, and which now already has the participation of 17 regulatory authorities in the region. Without going into further detail as to the achievements of this group, about which we will hear a presentation summarizing them for you, I'd like to mention continuous effort by the working groups in order to build capabilities by means of training activities throughout the region, especially to recognize the contribution of two of such authorities, INPIMA and SECMED, in the development of those courses that have benefited more than 500 professionals among the authorities in the region. Without detracting from it, I must say that the whole number of activities that regulatory authorities have undertaken very actively. The discussions on the global level as well. Members of the working group have participated in the makeup of the medical devices, including in vitro diagnosis and the worldwide WHO tool for the evaluation of national regulatory system for medical products, known as GBT because of its acronym in English, and the plus, which includes, of course, medical devices. And it is already available in the website of the WHO. As you all know, one of the main points of reference for the establishment of this GMT with medical devices has been the whole series of advanced indicators developed in the field or in the realm of the regional group. It is also important to highlight that 2020-21, in spite of the pandemic, and due to it precisely, many of the countries have participated in the update of the world framework of the regulatory framework of PAHO for medical devices, including medical devices for diagnosis in vitro, which are now under public consultation. You all acknowledge that both in the PARM network as well as in this forum and others, we deem that the extreme importance of maintaining a dialogue among and between the regulators and the regulated sector and other parties concerned. Therefore, since 2016, and in this case, what happens as of today, the regional working group has been organizing open sessions, which allow to discuss priority items regarding medical devices and challenges which they face on a regional basis. This open session for this year, which starts today and will be continued tomorrow morning, has the participants of the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Considerations, with which we have been discussing collaboration activities with a view to the establishment of a formal agreement. When we deal with the open part of this meeting and we go into the closed session after the open session, which is only available for regulatory authorities, which will be tomorrow afternoon and Friday morning. We will move into the 10 million regulatory authorities for the strengthening of medical devices, which gives a space for the exchange of information among regulatory authorities in order to discuss and learn about initiatives and international priorities, presenting the results of activities on the way of the regional working group, and finally to identify priorities in order to establish the working agenda 2022-2023. To conclude, I believe that all that I have told you very briefly this morning has to do with the achievement of each and every one of you, a very active group within PAHO, led by Alexandre, whom I would like to thank profusely, as well as members of his team, the acknowledgement for a tireless work in regarding this topic, which when we started discussing it a few years back, didn't have any background information in PAHO, had not been active with countries in the region. Within this pathway of reflection after 10 years, I believe it is worthwhile to assess the tremendous progress that has been made in the region, first in prioritizing medical devices indeed as essential products for health and having access, therefore, to the achievement of universal health. Secondly, the fact that these medical devices deserve to have a special chapter and a special one with a special attention in the region in view of the complexity and the very many devices as the tremendous variability of the risk that these pose to health as well as individuals. And finally, the very fact that all of this has been done by way of collaboration with a view to having a better harmonization and convergence and the adoption of the international standards that are best suited, working together with the IMRDF, the authorities that lead this effort throughout the region. So I can tell you, I believe that we'll have a very good meeting by a group that has become extremely productive. And I'm fully certain that we will continue to work like this for one more decade. A big hug to you, my warmest greetings, and tremendous success in this meeting. Alexandre, back to you. Thank you. Thank you, Analia, for these words of encouragement. which have been the best way to begin this 3-day work session. Thank you so very much for your participation. We have over 160 participants at this point in time who are now connected. They tell us through the chat, and in many instances, there are groups which are connected with us. I would say we have over 200 people at this point in time who are participating in this virtual meeting. I cannot read all of you. You can see it in the chat. Colleagues from SECMED, all of whom are here as well. Mario, Luz, Ernesto, Dirana, Pilar, etc. Greetings to Edima, the Matt. Also from several representatives of the coalition. So I invite you all to read the names here in the Chile, in Peru, in the chat. You can see all those who are joining us for this meeting. So thank you so very much indeed for your participation. We shall continue on keeping with our agenda. And we now have a summary which the Secretariat of the working group of PAHO prepares for us so as to have a summary of our activities. I would like to share with you, therefore, this information that will be shared by us very kindly for this 20-minute presentation, and then we will continue on with our agenda. Today, if you please, we could now move on to looking at our agenda for today, which is now up front on the screen. And to remind you, as was said by Analia, that indeed this open session has been organized and the agenda has been broadly discussed in several meetings together with the team of the coalition, the Secretariat, and the Inter-American Coalition, of course, with Sandra, with Leticia, with Stephen, in several meetings. And with us prepared this agenda that you now see on the screen for this morning. And tomorrow, too, during the morning, we will be having a panel discussion with the regulatory authorities to deal with the topic of the so-called reliance. I would like to address those authorities which have not yet confirmed their speakers to please be so kind to confirm as soon as possible who they will be so that we may have a final version of the agenda. We have most of the names of the representatives for it, but some of them have not yet confirmed their presentations. So I request that as soon as we conclude this session, will you please let us know who they will be so that we can distribute this information for the sake of those participating tomorrow morning's meeting. So now during 20 minutes, I will give you the update. Then Marie Valentin from WHO will speak about good regulatory practices for medical devices. Regrettably, Marie had a personal problem and was not able to join us personally this morning, but yesterday she sent in a recording of her presentation. And after that, we will have Sandra Ligia, who will be telling us about the work and activities of the Inter-American Coalition. And finally, we will be having question and answer period. We can forge ahead now if this is agreeable. And what you see up front are the 25 countries which are represented in our working group at this point in time. We continue to grow, as Analia told us during her presentation. This is a summary of the activities of the regional working group. Well, we show this slide, which presents all of the working axes that we have in the meetings, such as training, participation of IM, DRF, the technical groups, the indicators, medical devices, and practice communities, and so on. I will delve further into each one of these topics later on. So now we have included this slide because it is always good to remember the pre-COVID times where we could have presential meetings that were always so warm, where we could be close to one another, be able to hug others, and to be able to talk and speak directly face to face. However, we miss those times indeed, and when the emergency was declared back in the beginning of 2020, it became clear that 2020 would not be possible for us to hold a meeting, but we had the hope that by 2021, perhaps we would be able to hold a presential meeting. So we continued to delay it and postpone it because, of course, in the case of a virtual meeting, it is important because it also allows for the participation of a much broader number of people. But we wanted to have a physical meeting. So we postponed it in 2021 also because it wasn't possible to hold it. So we thought that 2022, it would be possible to do it during the first semester of this year, but it was not possible either. Since we had the last meeting held in Colombia with our colleagues of INVIMA, a wonderful organization, which for the second time have greeted us in Colombia in a wonderful manner, meetings which are truly excellent. And then so we reached a decision of having a virtual meeting once again, not to wait any further, because there are indeed many important topics which are in abeyance, pending discussion. And we decided to have a virtual meeting, and hopefully later on, perhaps, I don't know, during the second semester, we may have a presence or physical meeting, or otherwise, if there are no other surprises, we could have such physical meeting next year so that we may indeed be able to be together. And there are many countries which have participated in this meeting. Vis-a-vis the pandemic, we were able to have meetings every year.
We hope that we can return to the same format and the same frequency. So this is our agenda for the topics that we will be considering in this meeting. And we wanted to share this with the colleagues who cannot be present here in our meeting. We have the good practices on reliance within the context that we have, in which we have been. And we will have that will be session, open session, June 1 to 2nd. Then we will have a closed session for the regulators, June 2nd and 3rd. Then we will be talking about the blood pressure measures, support devices. So it is a very, very rich agenda, especially for tomorrow afternoon and June 3rd in the morning. Very briefly, just reviewing some of the activities with the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the IMDRF. As you know, we always participate in the IMDRF meetings. We have had several person-to-person meetings, several virtual meetings of the forum. And then, of course, the IMDRF members include Canada, and then, of course, as of last year, we already have Matt from Argentina. He's an official member. We have discussed this in a previous meeting. And then, in addition to the regulators cited here on this slide, I cannot mention the others, all of the others, but Brazil, Canada, United States, and we have also had the participation of other regulators in the region who have been there for several years. I see a comment from INVISA and FDA that in the English channel they are hearing an echo. I do not know if this is something that can be verified. We will see if this is a possible solution. There are several groups that are participating here too. In addition to AMNAC, INVIMA, SECMED, there are several groups, and also another group that was created a few months ago, but that group is on hold at the present time. So can we go ahead? These are the mirror groups, which are called that way because they duplicate or reproduce the working groups of the IMTRF. We have the REDMA program to begin with. Also, we had the practices for regulatory review in BIMA in Colombia. Then we had personalized medical devices in AMNAT Argentina. And we have to recognize that the pandemic has generated a lot of working groups. Not because of the topic of distance, but mainly because of the burden and the load of work that this has generated, especially for the additional work, enormous additional work that we have undertaken because of the pandemic. So we have activities that have required a lot of time for functional operation, for collecting documents. And right now, in the closed meeting, we will be discussing the possibilities for retaking all of these activities in a slower pace. Very well. I am very happy to announce that after significant delays, we finally were able to publish the first 6 documents in Spanish that you see here on the screen. We have all the authorizations necessary, the official approval from PAHO. You can access all of these through the web pages that appear here. We will be disseminating this information. We will be sending the links to all the participants. And these are the first 6 documents on regulatory guidelines, safety, and then, of course, the in vitro diagnosis, medical devices, labeling, and then the personalized medical devices, among others. You see the 6 ones that have been translated here on the screen. The translation team at PAHO works very well, but it has had an enormous amount of work with the translation of all of these documents. So it is significant that we have been able to produce them. And then finally, we were able to translate these important documents, and they are available. These 6 documents are available in Spanish. Please, next one. We have 2 more documents that are being translated right now. And then out of these, we have 3 in Portuguese. They are also in the final phase for publication. And these are being translated into Portuguese. And then we have others being translated into Spanish. So what you see here in green are close to the final translation process. And what you see here in a lighter color beige or green color is what is right now in the process of beginning translation. We have other regulating authorities that have started working on all of this. This is a good process that other institutions outside PAHO are also working on this. We don't want to monopolize the translation of all of these, but we do not want to duplicate efforts either. So some of these documents, just like I said, the ones in green are almost in the final phases of translation. And if you have, by any chance, you have other documents that are in your area in final process of translations, please do let us know. Do let us know. We just want to disseminate this important information. It's useful information, and we want the countries to have this available. We have a fantastic number of institutions that have expressed interest in these publications. All of you, or perhaps most of you, know the REDMA program, which is the exchange program of reports on adverse events on medical devices in the Americas. And then this is an exchange of reports on the events or adverse incidents caused by medical devices among regulatory authorities, and this is in the region of the Americas. So here we have just a chart showing what happened every year in the development of this program. We see the Secretariat here in 2014. Secretariat was SECMED and VISA and INVIMA. And then we created a secure platform. And this was kind of like a mirror group of the original group. But then I think as we went along, we improved our work better than the original, because I remember that the IMDRF, we had to exchange information in a different way. So because of that, or the problems we had, we created a very secure platform, and many countries had a pilot project to develop this. We had several technical meetings, and then we tried to have the price platform. You see this listed in 2019. This program was exchanged, and then there were lots of programs, and we have already 37 reports, 24 confidential and 13 public. And we started with just this, and I think from this we can go to a wider program. This is the REDMA web system, the platform. We have authorized personnel who will be using this. You have to have your email, your password, and so forth. This information is not public, but it is important to maintain the security of this information. And I would like to say that we have work groups. These work groups have been an important element, an important tool, and they kind of keep a memory of what we have done in this practice period. And this is available for discussion in fora, but through the media and the social media, we can share some information. But I think more than anything else, today we have this as an institutional memory, as a repository of information for our regional group. Analia also mentioned this in her presentation. We had more than 450 participants who benefited in 27 countries through virtual courses. SECMED and INVIMA participated in the training session, and all of the authorities participated in the development of these reports all of these years. Next one, please. So this was the last activity that was last year. It was a virtual course on techno-vigilance in Colombia. We had 125 participants registered, 14 countries benefited. They are listed here. And tomorrow, or perhaps the day after tomorrow, we will be discussing with the authorities what is the next program on training. Analia has also mentioned this global benchmarking tool. You already know about this tool of GBT. This global benchmarking tool incorporates medical devices. It's a very intense type of work with the authorities, the regulatory authorities. And we have a work group for the integration of indicators of medical devices and medical devices used for the diagnosis in vitro. Also, we have mentioned that a few years ago, we developed and had a pilot studies on integration and this tool, and this was the effort of WHO working towards the final version. These are some of the countries that have participated in the integration of the indicators of the medical devices and medical devices for in vitro diagnosis in the GBT. We see Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Cuba, Colombia, US, and Mexico, who have actively participated in these work groups. And now, as you very well know, this is the process followed. We have review, we have virtual meetings, and now we are going to amendments by consensus. And afterwards, we will have the pilot introduction of the tool. This will be conducted with WHO. This is the first pilot exercise that we will be conducting with WHO. This is the information I have received up to now. And then I would like to share that SECMED has expressed interest to WHO in conducting a pilot exercise in the region of the Americas with this GBT tool without a date. A date has not been decided upon yet. It's to be announced. I will not go into details with this. I have used my time, These are the regulatory functions of the GTB for medical devices. This is available in the webpage of WHO. You have the link here. It's not the final version yet. This is open to changes depending on the feedback that the WHO receives from the countries during the pilot exercise in the next few months. So I would say this link has the latest version. It's not the final version. We will be making adjustments in accordance with what the countries report. And then, of course, the countries will also participate in the evaluation, and they can tell us whether this is working okay, whether some indicators need to be reviewed or not. Also, you have the world model on the regulatory framework of WHO for medical devices, including medical devices for diagnosis in vitro. This document has been translated. The first version was published in 2017, and the update started in 2021. You can consult this in our webpage. Because of all the changes, we decided to work on an update because the document was already 5 years old. So we're working on this. We had more than 50 participants in this process with countries of our region who have been very active. And we have a process of discussion on the update of this document. And at the present time, we have a first round of public consultation. And you can consult that in the link here, and we will be organizing a session. We will let you know about the date. It will be in the next few days. And I believe June 15th, we will be confirming that. We will be perhaps organizing together with PAHO and WHO a session for the discussion with regulators about this document that is in the process of being updated.
This is something that we'd like to share with you as soon as we have information, a very important topic. And very likely this time we'll try to articulate with WHO better process. As soon as the public consultation has come back, we'll have a better process of translation so that all this information will be readily available in Spanish. This was mentioned by Analia in her opening remarks. I will not delve into the details, but just to highlight that this is a very important achievement for the sake of our countries and the regulatory authorities for medical devices. The regulatory authorities, the industry. Oftentimes we think that this can be just, a debate of a document that has no impact. No, such is not the case. It has tremendous impact. Before joining PAHO, I did not recognize that a document such as this one, governing bodies, could have such impact. Of course, some of them have a greater impact than others, but in this particular instance, the achievement has been great. What Analia told us that 10 years or 12 years ago, we had a resolution, the governing body speaking about regulation of medications without mentioning whatsoever these medical devices. And that 10 years after, it becomes necessary to renew this mandate. And then, of course, to recognize and bring in medical devices within the actual policy and recommendations, indeed, as a priority. For the first time in a document of the governing bodies of PAHO, this has been a great achievement. So, Let us follow this with great care, with much attention. The discussion by members of the executive committee in June now, and then in September, the Pan American Health Conference, and hopefully we will then have an adoption of this document that will be there toward the strengthening of the regulation of sanitary technology, medications, and medical devices in our region. So we can continue on now. We're coming toward the end of my presentation. I can delve a little bit further, but this is a slide. I will not go into the details. It's perhaps very lovely, but we don't have time to go into the details. Just to tell you that we've got a very new work line in our regional group, has to do with supporting products, support products. We call them PAs, Productos de Apoyo in Spanish, which improve our functioning and the independence of the individual, therefore promoting the well-being of the person. So people who have disabilities, for example, the elderly, 1/3, and this is very impressive, 1/3 of the worldwide population uses some sort of these support products or has used it in the past. And in many countries, these products are not, some of them are not considered even, but some of which are considered and could be included do not fall within the regulatory umbrella. And there are many quality products with such products. This is why we have undertaken this plea, urging the authorities to be able to discuss this topic. And there will be a specific panel on June the 3rd for regulatory authorities on this matter. This is the final of my slides. We would like to remind you about the important work we're carrying out. Most of the authorities are not familiar with this initiative. It is a draft that we submitted a few months back, funded with funds from the US of A, to strengthen the capability for quality control of personal protective equipment, PPE. The idea is to have these so-called hubs. We call them hubs, sub-regional hubs in Central America and South America. The one in Central America would be located in El Salvador, the regulatory authority and the lab they have. And for South America, the hub will be Colombia, the lab of INVIMA. With regard to this project in which we're working very intensely, it is our idea to equip these labs so that they may have all the necessary preconditions to conduct all of the necessary quality tests for breathers or particles and masks. These are some of our priorities. We can incorporate, of course, other types of PPEs as well, but this is our main priority, and we will have the funds to purchase such equipment so that these labs may be equipped toward the end of this year, so that by next year they may start conducting assessments of the actual performance, quality performance of such products in their own countries, of course, and also working, as we said, as a hub for the sub-region. So it is a project of great relevance. We have come to the conclusion after the pandemic that our region, especially Latin America and the Caribbean, we have not had installed capacity that is broad enough in order to assess the quality of the equipment PPE manufactured in the region. Hence, we have proposed this new approach. Very well, then, I think we have come to the end of my expose. Thank you very much for your attention. And we will continue on with our agenda. Next, we'll have a question-answer session. Nilda and our colleagues, Stephanie and other team members will be helping us organizing the question. There's a question that reached me. in the meanwhile, because they continue to appear on the chat. But there's one that says, in keeping with which norms? It would be in keeping with internationally recognized norms for quality standards of ISO and others, or the PPEs. So, in case of the breathers, it is 95, FP2, European standard, Chinese standard, etc. All of these breathing equipment can be adjusted in order to verify. And just to give you an example, without going into technical details, but if we're speaking on FP2, 94% filtration, perhaps 95% filtration, and so on, in accordance with the actual requirement in the test. Later on, if we have more time, we could go into the details. For now, I think that we are in good time. So I would ask Nilda to show us the video with the presentation of Marie Valentin. Her name, I think, is pronounced Valentin in French, who will be discussing the good regulatory practices. So whenever we are ready, please go ahead.
Good morning. Many thanks for inviting us to present today the WHO Good Regulatory Practices and the application for the regulatory oversight of medical devices, because it's a very key document to improve the regulatory capacity and regulatory oversight of medical devices. My name is Marie Valentin, and I'm a technical officer in the Regulatory Conventions and Network team at WHO headquarters in Geneva. So this is just a quick overview of what we will be discussing today. First, I will give an overview of the regulatory systems situation and the major challenges, a bit about the WHO program on regulatory system strengthening and the global benchmarking tool. And then we will dive into the documents of the good regulatory practices, the principles, and the enablers for the good regulatory practices. Also, to finish, we will touch upon WHO good reliance practices. And I know that reliance is a focus topic for this conference, and it's been going to be discussed quite a bit during the conference. So I think it's important also to mention the principle of reliance. So if we start from an observation, and we knew before, but the response to the COVID-19 pandemic has even shown even more that we need strong regulatory systems. And to have strong regulatory systems, international collaboration and reliance are an integral part of this strong regulatory system. We know that regulators across the globe are facing increasing challenges and workloads in terms of globalization of markets, complexity of supply chains, and all this with a limited global resources in terms of financial, technical, and human resources. And so it's very important to have international collaboration and use reliance where possible in order to make best use of the already done assessment or inspection, etc. So the objective of the WHO Regulatory System Strengthening Program, I've got two main pillars. It is to build regulatory capacity in member states consistent with the good regulatory practices, and to promote regulatory cooperation, convergence, and transparency through networking, work sharing, and reliance. So these two main goals of the Regulatory System Strengthening Program at WHO, they are anchored into the World Health Assembly Resolution 6720 that was adopted in 2014, that recognizes the importance of strong regulatory system to a well-functioning healthcare system and the attainment of health-related sustainable development goals and universal health coverage. So the first step to help in regulatory system strengthening is to look at what level are the different regulatory system. And for this, we've got a tool at WHO, so the global benchmarking tool. And here I'm just going to give a brief overview of the principle, because I know that my colleague Agnès Quigeot, later on during the conference, she will be presenting in particular the GPT-4 medical devices that have just been released. And it was going to go for pilot implementation. So I just wanted to present the tool as a general concept and principle. So the tool includes 250 indicators, and for each of the regulatory function, it helps in determining the level of maturity for the different regulatory system. And there are four maturity levels, from 1 to 4, with 4 being the highest. So we look at, for example, for maturity level 1, with regulatory system with no formal approach, to 2 with a more reactive approach, to the level 3, which is the stable and the formal system approach, is more stable, and it is the aim and the target of the WHO resolution 6720, to have as many as possible countries attaining and reaching maturity level 3. Then to maturity level 4, which is the highest level, and a fully functional regulatory system and mature regulatory system. So the tool, I won't go into detail, but just to say that it covers all the different regulatory functions, and for each of the functions, there is a series of indicators where we can assess and determine which level of maturity the different national regulatory systems are at. So if we look at the picture today, we can see that most of the regulatory system and the NRAs in our member states, 71% actually, are 138 countries are at maturity level 1 or 2. So there's still a lot of efforts needed on the global scale to try to reinforce and strengthen the regulatory capacity of member states. And we can see that only 29%, so 56 countries, have reached maturity level 3 or 4. And what are the main challenges for countries to reach this level? Obviously, there is the need for more resources in terms of finance and human resources. But also sometimes what we've seen is that there might be a lack of national policy or long-term strategy for the regulatory system. There might not be a clear vision and mission of what the system should do and not do. And there might be insufficient commitment or engagement at political level. So what we've seen when we use the global benchmarking tool, that sometimes we can see some bad regulatory practices. And that's why this document of the good regulatory practices was developed. The global benchmarking tool is also used to help, so it gives a picture at a time of the maturity level, but more importantly, it allows the countries to create a roadmap and to create a clear list of what they should be working on or what they can do to increase the maturity level. So they can develop we develop with them a country institutional development plans. So for each of the regulatory functions, we can clearly detail what are the actions needed in the future to try to reach the maturity level of the regulatory systems. So for the access to safe, effective, and quality and affordable medical products, we know that there are different important work streams in terms of having the legal framework, having the norms and standards, the relevant leadership. Also an important part is having a quality management system for the regulatory system, and obviously the resource that we have mentioned already. So these good regulatory practices have been developed to try to encompass all these different aspects and to give a list of best practice and high-level principles to have efficient regulatory oversight. So what are the good regulatory practices? As I briefly mentioned, it's actually, it was created and developed as a response from member states to request for guidance in addressing common gaps in regulatory practices that were identified during the benchmarking exercise. So when you use the benchmarking, we could see that sometimes there were not so good regulatory practices, and countries were very keen in having a guide for this high-level principle and what should be the good regulatory practices. So it's a set of principles and practices applied to the development, implementation, and a review of regulatory instruments in order to achieve a public health policy objective in the most efficient way. What is important to highlight is that these good regulatory practices are relevant to all regulators, so irrespective of resources, maturity, or regulatory model, and it is applicable to nationally, so for regulatory authorities, but also supranational organizations in terms of authorities that may regulate more than one country or multiple institutions. So this document presents the high-level principle of the good regulatory practice, and it can be used as a benchmark for country to see what are the principle or the practice that are considered as good practice in terms of regulatory oversight. So this can guide member states in prioritizing their regulatory activities, and this has to be done at national level because there is not one size fits all, but in terms of their resources, their national goals, their public health policy, the medical product policies, and the medical product environment. So they can define what are the priorities and concentrate on the main principles that they have to work on or to implement further. It's relevant for all regulators, as we've seen, and initially it was developed for regulators, but also for a related audience in terms of institution and policymakers, regulatory networks, and regulated parties, because it's very important to highlight that the good regulatory practices have to be implemented by the full, the total, all the stakeholders, and industry and manufacturers are a very big part of the puzzle for the implementation of the good regulatory practice. Here we've put the link of the document that was adopted in October 2020, and it was released or published in March 2021. So what are the objectives of the good regulatory practice? Is to ensure a sound and effective regulation of medical products, to reach higher quality regulation, to improve the decision-making process and compliance, make the regulatory system more efficient, and to try to have better public outcome. It can be used to update the regulatory system, because we know many countries have got their regulatory system, but they might want to update some aspect of their regulatory system. And also, it's to promote trust between regulatory authorities. If we all work towards the same practices and best practices, then trust can be reinforced and strengthened. And also to facilitate international collaboration. What's important to highlight is that it's not a unique document, it's part of a larger catalog of documents and important principles in terms of good governance practices, good review practices, good reliance practices that we will mention at the end of the presentation today, and also the quality management system for regulatory authorities. So the good regulatory practices documents highlight 9 principles, and we will go into the detail of some of these principles, but just to present them here. So it's legality, consistency, independence, impartiality, proportionality, flexibility, clarity, efficiency, and transparency. And we can say that this list someone might say, or one could argue that it's not exhaustive. What happened for this document, it was long in the making, and it was discussed for many years after consultation with relevant stakeholders and member states, and we had different workshops. So from the discussion, it was felt that this list, although not exhaustive, and you could also see that some of them are interlinked and they are very closely related, but for the document, it was agreed that these 9 principles were the 9 main level principles necessary and required for the good regulatory practice. The ultimate aim of the good regulatory practice is to serve and protect public health and patient interests with respect for all applicable ethical principles. So now if we look a bit more into the different principles, and here you can see that what we wanted to also highlight is that there is a close link between the good regulatory practice and the global benchmarking tool. So there's a tool that is used for assessing the maturity level, and they are closely interlinked because what we're trying to promote is also the building of regulatory capacity that is promoted through the GBT. So regarding legality, it's very important for regulatory system and the decision that flow from them to have a sound legal basis. So the legal framework should clearly define the scope and lines of authorities of the different institutions. It should give authority to the relevant bodies to have the scope and flexibility to safeguard and promote health, and to delegate the power and the responsibilities. Also, very important, there should be a tool to a mean to review regulatory decision and sanctions. So in terms of reviewing regulatory decision, there should be a appeal process to make sure that the user or the manufacturer could potentially, they have the possibility to request for a review or a re-examination, for example, or an appeal. And also it's very important to define what are the sanctions if the regulated parties do not follow the proposed legal framework. The regulatory bodies should be accountable, so they should be responsible for their decision, and it should be transparent about what are the responsibilities they are accounted for. The second principle is consistency. So the regulatory oversight of medical products should be consistent with the existing government policies and legislation, and also it should be applied in a consistent and predictable manner. So, for example, for the user, the manufacturer, they should know what type of procedure, what type of line of oversight they can expect for the similar type of products. Any new piece of legislation should fit currently into the national legal and policy framework, and it should be complementary and not conflicting. So any addition of a regulatory oversight or a new piece of legislation, for example, should complement nicely what is already existing. And the implementation and the enforcement should be also consistent. And here again, we wanted to show that it's very closely linked to the GBT, the tool that is used to assess the maturity level in terms of marketing authorization and regulatory system. So here the abbreviation is the different indicators for the regulatory function, MA between being marketing authorization and RS being regulatory system. The third one is very, very important. It's independence. And from the large and collective experience that we've had in regulatory system strengthening and benchmarking, we see that this is a very difficult one and tricky one sometimes to implement. The institution responsible for regulation of medical products should be independent. So they should be operating in an independent and authoritative manner. They should discharge their duty independently from politicians, governments, and regulated entities. Because any improper and undue influence of stakeholders on regulatory activity and decision is not acceptable. So one part important to highlight here is regarding the funding. So how is the regulatory system funded? Is it fully independent? Because you can imagine that if the funding, for example, come too largely without any control from the industry or from someone that can have an influence on the decision, this shouldn't be acceptable. Also, the leadership in terms of regulatory system should be independent. Here we could take an example for example, to illustrate this principle. We've had cases where we would help a country and do jointly an inspection, and we could see that the inspectors were doing their job very well, and they had found some major funding during the inspection. However, in the final outcome, we realized that they didn't put this major funding because it turned out that the manufacturing site that they were inspecting was actually linked to the Ministry of Health in that specific country. So obviously they didn't have the freedom to objectively criticize or find findings and shortcomings in this specific site because somehow it was linked to the Ministry of Health. So independence is extremely important in terms of being able to give the unbiased regulatory oversight. The next one is impartiality, and here we could say that it's strongly linked also to independence, because you cannot be impartial if you're not fully independent in terms of your regulatory decision. So all regulated parties should be treated equitably, fairly, and free from bias. It is very important in that context to have proper policies for conflict of interests and checking that staff from the regulatory authorities and experts involved in the decision and in the assessment or the inspection have got no conflict of interest. The operation should be any type of regulatory activity should be impartial, and the assessors or the inspector shouldn't be involved in some of the activities that they have to regulate. And sometimes it's difficult, for example, in specific niche area, to find experts that have no engagements in some of the activities. But it's very important to ensure that for the decision and for decision making, there is no bias in terms of having been involved in previous activities. And one of the very key principles for impartiality is to base all the decision on science and on the evidence and the data at stake. So to make sure that the decision making is science and evidence based. The next one is proportionality. It's very important to ensure that the regulatory oversight and the regulatory decision are proportional to the risk and to the regulator's capacity to implement and enforce the decision. And here, one of the easy way to mention it is that a law with modest aims and objectives that is properly enforced is preferable to a more comprehensive one that cannot be implemented. So sometimes it's maybe small steps, but what is important is to ensure that we can implement this regulatory oversight and that we can implement this legal framework. We cannot. There is no point in having a concept of the best regulatory system if it cannot be implemented, and this is very important. So it should be adequate to achieve the objective without being excessive. So for any new, for example, piece of legislation or regulatory oversight, an impact analysis can be done in terms of how is the best way to regulate these activities, and does it have to be done by the regulatory authority itself, or can it be done by other mechanisms of control, for example? For example, for advertising, in some countries, the control is left to the industry and to the different manufacturer to keep an eye on the different promotional material and to report in case of anything. But it is left to actually the association of the pharmacy company to monitor this promotional material. It should be proportionate to the risk. It should not exceed the national capacity to implement and enforce. As we said, we cannot create a big machine if we can't implement it. And what is very important as well is to always, it should be a continuous monitoring. So the benefit risk evaluation is a continuum, and it's not done at a certain time at the time of evaluation. But as the product stay on the market, we have to make sure that the assessment of the positive benefit risk remain positive throughout the life cycle of products. The next one is flexibility, and we've heard a lot about flexibility and agility during the response to COVID-19 pandemic, because it's a very important aspect for regulators. As we've seen, they face many challenges. So the regulatory oversight should be flexible in order to respond to a changing environment and unforeseen circumstances. It should be sufficiently flexible to reflect and to respond to changes. And we know that sometimes it's difficult when we create a legal framework because it might not give the full flexibility, but it's very important to keep some margin to be flexible and to be able to reply to new changes or to public health emergency, to shortages, etc. It should give some alternative approaches when needed, and also the flexibility should be applied in terms of good judgment. So what is possible to be done in a certain situation, and how can regulators act to offer the best regulatory oversight. The seventh principle is clarity, and this is very important because, as we said, the regulatory landscape, and we will see at the end of the presentation, there is a diagram reflecting that. It's an equilibrium between all the actors of the pharmaceutical world, in terms of manufacturer, in terms of regulators, in terms of players, in terms of governments. So the regulatory requirements should be accessible to and understood by users. It is very important to be clear of what is expected from the regulated party. It should be in an understandable language. The terminology should be consistent with international norms and standards. For any new piece of legislation or guideline, it is good practice to have some consultation with the stakeholders or the regulated parties, to have education and training to ensure that we can disseminate any new guidelines as best as possible, and also to offer the proper interpretation of the regulation. The process should be clear and based and should allow for taking regulatory decision and enforcement. So it should be very clear for the regulated parties what is expected from them and what would be the consequences if they do not respect the legal framework. Efficiency, the one before last principle. The regulatory system should achieve the intended results with the required time and at reasonable effort and costs. This is to achieve the public health goals and to make the best use of the resources and information from other authorities. So if we try to look at the global burden of regulatory oversight, it's where international collaboration is key, and using the outputs from other regulators to ensure that we can make best use of the available assessment and inspection, and to avoid duplication when we can. So this is why we promote reliance, and it is very important for medical devices in terms of, as we know that so a lot of countries, for example, are building their regulatory or legal framework in terms of oversight of medical devices. And while they are building it, it's very important to, when possible, use the assessment or the evaluation made by other bodies to ensure the quality of products that are circulating. One of the aspects that facilitates the efficiency is the alignment of regulatory requirements. So we always advise to follow the international norm and standards, and to allow for collaboration and building trust between regulators. So the last but not least, is transparency. And we know that the old days of regulatory system being a machine, and we would put an application and have no news, and then after a certain period of time hear something at the end, have long gone, because there is a very clear requirements and expectation from the public, from the healthcare professional, from the patients, to know what is being done and what are the activities, the regulatory activities. And even more so in terms of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, because regulators have been in the spotlight, and so the public and the patient, they want to know what is happening with the regulatory decision. So really here we promote a culture of openness that should be supported at the highest level. As we mentioned, anytime there is a new legislation or a new guideline, there should be some process of consulting the stakeholder. Where possible, there should be access to the regulation, to the decision. And this is also some indicators in the global benchmarking tool. And you can imagine, as some countries build their regulatory system, it might not be possible at the beginning to have a full level of transparency. However, there's an expectation that as they grow in maturity level, there should be transparencies regarding the legal framework, the guideline, the decision, the output, the assessments. Then for what we can look at is the enablers. So we know that we've got all this principle of good regulatory practice, but we've got some enablers in terms of we have identified that some aspect can help in facilitating the implementation of the good regulatory practice. So the first one is the political and government-wide support. The implementation should be supported at the highest political and government level. There should be an effective organization and good governance supported with leadership. There should be inter and intra-organizational communication, collaboration, and coordination. And this is in particular important when we have several institutions responsible for the regulatory oversight of products. And very importantly, there should be a robust and well-functioning quality management system. Some of the other enablers are sufficient and sustainable financial resources, obviously, and competent human resources. So it's very important. I think a regulatory authority is as good as the staff is, and it's very important to ensure continuous training and proper education of the staff. Also some preset organizational ethics and value. And the last one that we've seen for impartiality and independence, science and data-driven decision-making process. So this one is a figure that is in the document of good regulatory practice, and this is to highlight the full picture with the 9 good regulatory principles, the enablers, and then the full picture of regulatory system in terms of regulatory function, regulatory outputs and outcome, and the impact of the regulatory system. But we can see that it's a global aspect of the regulatory institution, the regulatory framework, and the resources. To finish, I would want to just say a few words about reliance. And as I mentioned, I know that it's going to be a hot topic for this conference. So as we've seen that regulators are facing challenges and increased workload, and this with the same level of resources or sometimes reduced resources. So it's very important globally to make the best use of the available resources and to concentrate regulatory effort and resources where they are most needed. So the international cooperation and collaboration is essential to ensure the safety, quality, and efficacy of locally used medical products. And actually, no regulatory authorities nowadays can do the work alone. Even the most resource authority cannot do the regulatory oversight alone. So here is to make best use of available resources and try to avoid duplication when we can. The good reliance practice define reliance as the act whereby the regulatory authorities in one jurisdiction takes into account and gives significant weight to assessment performed by another regulatory authority or trusted institution, or to any other authoritative information in reaching its own decision. And we know there is various forms and shapes of reliance. What's important to highlight here is that the relying authorities remain independent, responsible, and accountable regarding the decision taken, even if it relies on the decision or assessment of others. So this is just a graphic to show that in terms of historically, when we had very independent decision and no work sharing or no sharing of information, there is a certain type of duplication, a certain level of duplication. And the more we use reliance, the less we have duplication and the more efficient the system becomes. This is the 6th principle for the good reliance practice, and you can see that some of them are common with the good regulatory practice. So universality, sovereignty, transparency, respect of national and regional legal basis, consistency, and competency. What I wanted to highlight here is that regulatory system, even with fewer resources, they can be as effective as others with more resources if they use a risk-based approach to the work and decision of other regulatory authorities, and if they focus their resource on essential value-added activities. So again, here it's not a one-size-fits-all, but it's for each of the regulatory authority to define their own strategy in terms of what type of products they evaluate, what are the level of resources that they have and expertise that they have available, what are the opportunities for reliance, what other authorities can they work with, and what are the public health needs and priorities for the country. Just to finish, I wanted to give, and there are many examples in the medical device field, and they are growing, the number is growing in terms of using reliance. For example, the WHO collaborative registration procedure for in vitro diagnostic, that is a very successful tool to facilitate the registration of in vitro diagnostic in country by using the assessment performed by the pre-qualification team at WHO. There is also some abridged pathways for the approval of medical devices. If it's already authorized by another regulatory authority, some countries will do an abridged pathway evaluation. There are lots of reliance pilots happening in different regions in terms of sharing assessment reports. And also, for example, there can be a reliance system for a group of countries. So we know that the medical device single audit program, where a few countries have shared their resources and a pool of resources to have one single auditing organization that can do the audits and that the output can be used and recognized by several countries. So it's a saving of resources and a good use of resources. But also work sharing. So with, for example, the Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, United Kingdom, the access, they look at ways also to do some work sharing for medical devices and mutual recognition, for example, the system in Europe with the notified body. So ready to finish, I wanted to highlight again the crucial role of the good regulatory practice and good reliance practice for the regulatory system strengthening activities. They are very important for all stakeholders, and all stakeholders should be involved for the implementation. And here highlighting the role of the industry in implementing the good regulatory and reliance practices. And reliance is an essential tool for efficiency of the global regulatory oversight of medical products. And with that, I will stop. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I apologize. My apologies that I couldn't join online and directly, but I'm happy to receive any question in writing, and I will be happy to answer some of the questions. And I thank you for your attention.
Okay, bien.
Very well then. A very complete presentation by our colleague Marie Valentin. And as she stated in her recording, she is available in case you have any questions. We could convey it to her, and we'll send you later on the actual answer. Regrettably, she was not able to be with us today physically, but let me tell you that we already have more than 240 people who have joined us for this meeting. And as we said, we have many authorities who come together in the different halls. Maybe we have more than 300 people joining us at this point in time. Thank you for your keen interest and your participation as well. As we said, we will have a second round of questions at the end of today's session. And with this, I will move on directly now to invite Sandra Ligia, whom I'm sure you all well know, Executive Secretary for the Inter-American Association for Regulatory Convention that facilitates medical technology, IACRC, which has been very important in the conduction of this dialogue. Sandra Ligia Gonzalez, thank you to you. Thank you so very much for participating with this in this continuous dialogue we have undertaken. I worked with regulatory authorities for over 10 years, and always I realized that the dialogue with the productive sector and the private sector is very relevant, always being done in a very transparent fashion. Very likely, these regulatory authorities in the private sector, perhaps there is no agreement with regard to all the topics, which is only normal, but there are many issues where we have a win-win situation. A win-win situation where there is convergency and agreement, consensus And where there's no consensus, by the way, in a very transparent manner, we have to dialogue and to express the various perspectives and approaches. So as was said by Analia in her opening words, and in following a model that has been used by the IMDRF years ago, we have decided for several years now already, I don't recall how many, more than 5 years, I think, where we have developed and had this we call open sessions. The open sessions, we had them in Canada, in El Salvador, in Colombia, and in several other countries where we held these meetings, always very broad participation. And this is something which we will maintain, we will keep, because it has been a very successful endeavor in order to share and exchange and have a dialogue together with the private sector. So Sandra Nigia, you now have the floor. Thank you again for being with us today, and I yield the floor to you. Go ahead. Thank you, Alexandre. In fact, we are the ones who thank you for this possibility to share and collaborate, something that we greatly value and appreciate, because we acknowledge that the contribution coming from different baggages and experience cases eventually is something which is always to the benefit of the patients, of the population, for whom we're all working and with whom we're all committed. So in that regard, Alexandre, really and truly, thank you so very much for this opportunity to be able to collaborate with you and to share that which we're doing as a coalition focused precisely on this regulatory convergence, which we believe is indeed the true vehicle, the pathway that will facilitate the actual implementation of the reliance mechanisms that both the World Health Organization as well as the Pan American Health Organization have been promoting with tremendous emphasis as of the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic pushed us, led us into having a much broader approach and a deeper understanding of topics that had been on the table and which have been dealt with a certain degree of speed throughout the years. But the pandemic made for this speed to increase exponentially. This is why I thank you again for this opportunity and for allowing us to participate in this space. We have prepared a few slides to share with you that which we are doing as part of the work and commitment of our coalition, and to which we invite all participants in this meeting to contribute, and anyone who may be interested in these matters to join us. All the work that we do is open to all of the relevant actors in our sector, because we're fully convinced that to the extent that we all share knowledge, that we will all be sharing opinion and understanding, we will be able to forge ahead much more readily in this pathway toward convergence. So let us then start, as the agenda tells us, with our purpose, which is that of sharing the work we're carrying out to contribute toward the progress and the efforts toward the strengthening and regulatory convergence in the region. My submission and this presentation, that of the Mai and Alexandre, will be published also at the website of the coalition. Here you may find the link to the website, and Leticia Fonseca, under Executive Secretary for the coalition, will also be including it in the chat in case you want to have immediate access to this information. What is this coalition, for those of you who may not have had an opportunity to work with us? The purpose of this coalition is to work toward the strengthening of a regulatory convergence all across the board of the American continent. This coalition is working nowadays in 10 countries through 18 associations and chambers, and we're collaborating likewise in a very intense manner with the members of many organizations that develop standards such as ISO, ACAME, and so on. So the summarized version of our coalition is one that we're working in order to come to a point where we can actually may have one single standard, one single proof and standard that will be accepted anywhere in our continent and of course throughout the world as well, in order not to generate isolated efforts, that it be a global effort applying to all fields of technology in the Americas. If I have a consensus with regards, let us say, good manufacturing practices for medical devices through the ISO 1345 standard management quality systems, and I have implemented it also by way of the audit program for medical devices ISAP, that would be the one and only norm, the one and only standard that would apply for this particular field that may be accepted anyway, anywhere, and which obviously may be able to apply the reliance and in a much more efficient the resources pertaining to all the relevant actors. Likewise, and within our mission, what we try to do is that the regulation standards for the incorporation of medical technology will also be harmonized internationally. For doing this, we have a technical secretariat, which is made up, as I said, Leticia Fonseca, who is our executive undersecretary for the coalition for the entire continent, and the executive secretary, particularly for Brazil, Renata Amaral, who is our expert and leader in the good regulatory practices field. Yours truly as an executive secretary, and also we have the participation of Patricia Wood and Andrew Risi, who help us with collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank or the American Business Dialogue, the World Bank, and so on. We also have an executive committee, which is renovated every 2 years. It's been 2 years since the activities of the coalition began. So we're about to renew this executive committee. This board has 6 permanent members who are the actual representatives, Aguineta, Lavita, and Albanet. And we have 4 rotating members, which are renewed every 4 years through a method of rotation among all the main members. For the first 2 years, they represented Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Argentina. So on the score of the actual interaction we have with the various institutions to generate a synergy in this convergency effort and to avoid overlapping in the work, to sum up efforts. Throughout the last 2 years, we have managed to become members of Global Medical Technology Alliance, Global Diagnostics Alliance, the Global Harmonization Working Party, and which was the Asian Harmonization Working Party until a few months ago. Recently, we had the great honor of being invited to participate in the advisory committee of the Regional Platform for Advancement in the Production of Vaccines and Other Sanitation Technologies Against COVID-19 in the Americas by the Pan American Health Organization. As Alexandre told us, we have been working very closely and within this process formalizing all this interaction with PAHO itself. We have already submitted an application in order to obtain the quality as an observer member in PAHO, and we hope that this will indeed happen very shortly, very soon. In a constant way, we collaborate with the World Health Organization, and obviously PAHO, the World Trade Organization, and several other national regulatory agencies for this different types of work that we carry out. And basically that which has to do with this basic approach of our coalition that has to do with the building of capabilities. And as I said, the building of such capabilities for all the actors concerned, notwithstanding the sector from which they may participate in as regards medical devices. In that regard, we have taken up the task of establishing a website that will be a true repository of all that we need to know, tools to be applied for all the actors concerned, but we have designed it also in such a way that all the involved participants may have access to all the materials, to all the workshops, to all the webinars that we have been organizing on various topics that we have identified as a result of the dialogue we've undertaken with the various regulatory entities in the region and the various members of the coalition in order to develop such capabilities and be able to align our criteria and forge ahead, not just in that agenda of the regulatory convergence, which is critical from the standpoint, from a procedural standpoint, as Marie was telling us in her presentation, but furthermore to be able to work in the solution of specific challenges posed by certain regulations and which as such may generate some sort of hindrance in order to have access to these medical devices in various countries. It's a collaborative effort. It's a joint effort. We very much appreciate the feedback that you may send us with regard to opportunities of improvement of our website as regards incorporation of new topics or new information, approaching new information. We kindly invite you not just to use it yourselves, but you learn about all the tools which are therein under available, but also that you become actual collaborator in their construction so that we may all together benefit to the greater possible extent from its content. Since we know that the problems of language can constitute an important barrier in order to forge ahead in our objectives, all of the materials which have been included in our website are available in both English and Spanish. When we have training sessions, we are conducting them with simultaneous interpretation, in most cases, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. In some others, just English and Spanish, which are the vast majority of them. Also, as regards the presentations which are shared with you throughout these sessions, so that whenever there is a need to delve further into any of the topics, we may all have access to such materials. We may have access to the sources of the information because now we have the possibility of contacting all those experts who have been working with us in all the initiatives that we have created in order to develop better capabilities. On the website, in summary, we have certain basic approaches that have to do with the international norms, international standards as regards international reference, such as the World Health Organization, the global framework, regulatory framework, the lines of good regulatory practices and good reliance practices produced by the World Health Organization last year, as well as the first one that was mentioned by Marie in her presentation. But also, those are the topics we're working with IMR. As regards good practice, good regulatory practices, and this is all that we have all wanted to know about good regulatory practices, not just from the standpoint of sanitation, as we see in the first portion of this slide, but furthermore within the perspective of legal obligations through the commitments acquired by the countries by being signatories or members of various organizations.
And of course, we have to consider the topics of transparency and trade and the access to all of those topics in the region. Regarding the capabilities, we will be talking about 3 secondary menus that we have here. We have sessions with regulators, we have specific international norms and seminars. We will have to consider this from a global perspective together with the regulatory authorities. And then, of course, we have developed other ways of meeting of the minds to be able to join other countries, especially in Colombia. We have been working in several aspects of these topics with the National Planning Department and the Ministry of Health. And you have access, you may have access to all of these trainings. And then sessions with the regulators. Here are some of the ones that we have had with the national uh, agencies, especially on the single identification system. And last week, we had a series of meetings with the related to the ICO 13485. And we had an expert on this topic. We have all the materials available in the website. It is interesting to see all of this because we have been actually trying to explore what agencies do for decision makers. So something else that we have organized is the utilization of international norms for the development of regulations. And in the next few weeks, we will have a new series about medical devices, and we will be sharing this with you. As I said, this is a topic that is very important. The language barrier is something really important, and the Pan American Health Organization, we have taken very serious steps to make these documents available in Spanish and other languages. We are working through the coalition to develop some documents in Spanish. They are unofficial translations. They are not official translations, but we want to continue to do this, and we hope that in the new versions, we will have other versions available in Spanish about the guidelines of the World Health Organization, good regulatory practices, reliance practices, and then we will give you the links to all of these documents. They will be available to you. About documents that have been produced by the IMDRF, we have several available in Spanish. We have a software as medical device and clinical investigation. All of these have been work that is urgent to us together with COFEPRIS, and we are working in Colombia on these topics. Today, we have all of these topics in process for documentation support. Regarding the authorizations for emergency use, we know that we have a need for the use of these in the region. So we are working on the translation of all of these documents. There is another work that we are conducting with members of the coalition, and that is the positioning documents. When we know that there's a process in development about a new law, a new regulation, or a new update, Marie has already, of course, informed us on all of these processes and the regulatory steps and what we need to do for the generation of draft versions. So when we have something like a technical rule that is compulsory for the bodies involved, for instance, when we talk about the access of patients to medical devices, because of technical reasons that requires alignment with international regulations, we visit those areas in which we don't have any guidelines to make sure that these position documents are presented to the regulatory authorities. in the country in which this situation has arisen. So we work also with the International Trade Organization when it has to do with commerce. And then we have also updates that require consultations with international bodies in order to make sure that there are no discrepancies. So in that sense, we have developed some documents for Chile, Ecuador, and Mexico about good manufacturing practices, for Mexico about regulatory practices for Chile, and traceability regulation for Ecuador. And so we have taken all of these factors into consideration, and we have reached the conclusion that the way in which regulations, in the case of Ecuador, were proposed, had to be within the framework of international norms. So Ecuador withdrew this regulation from publication until it conformed to the international rules. So they will re-enter this regulation. Just, of course, this is, they have presented this to their own Congress. And then this has to do with good regulatory practices and the fundamental principles to apply the regulation process. And for that reason, Ecuador has taken those measures. In general, I would say that we have been working within the coalition framework with all countries, and we have a project which gave birth to the coalition, and that was the project on regulatory convergence of medical devices. And so we have a public and private initiative led by the United States, and that was an alliance for standards through USAID. And then we established the American National Standards Institute guidelines. And this project not only covers Latin America, 4 countries in Latin America, but also Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. But also we are working with Ghana in Africa, and in Asia, we are working with Indonesia and Vietnam. So here, this is what we have been doing in Colombia. Each one of the countries has had a model like this. In this particular matrix, you will see that you have 4 points. We have 2 fundamental aspects. One thing has to do with procedures, and the other has to do with technical matters. The procedures here shows as to how we can help regulation within the framework of COVID-19, and also what actions could be generated to help the regulators recover from COVID-19. So we understand the impact that we have in matters of procedure here, not only responding to the urgent situations that we have at present, but also to look at the future to see what not only the regulations and the regulatory agencies in the future, but also the total ecosystem in which these processes will be and procedures will take place. And then we have also talked to the regulators in the countries, to the representatives of the country. We have dealt with topical and technical issues within the regulatory agencies. So here we have all the aspects related to COVID-19, the recovery from COVID-19, and the technical aspects. We are not only working with environmental agencies, but also with other government agencies that are responsible for the introduction of good regulatory practices in the entire government as a whole. And so this is just like a whole unit. Here is what we have been working with Peru. Essentially, we are supporting the annual review that is required in Peru, the respect to all the procedures that take place within the medical device field. This is an annual review. And so here we are not only studying regulations, but also quality. And we are reviewing the requirements for all of these procedures. We want to make sure that they are up to date and whether the procedures can be simplified without generating a risk or a foreseen risk in matters of regulation. So we want to make sure that these processes are more effective and are done faster. So the topic has to do with the possibility of having access to medical devices, especially in countries where the health conditions vary. Some areas may have good or bad rates. So with this, very briefly, we are also working, as you know, next week we will have the Summit of the Americas, and we have major expectations for that. We hope that we will have a commitment declaration by the countries regarding wider cooperation and more extensive cooperation for good regulatory practices, and also emphasis on some elements of those practices. For instance, the analysis of regulation impact, the retroactive review of regulations, and the use of international norms and standards to be able to personalize the reliance mechanisms. So we at PAHO and WHO are promoting all of these mechanisms of reliance. And so I now reach the end of my presentation. I'm open to questions. And we have a lot of acronyms. And I am just providing here a list of all the acronyms that you will have within the coalition documents. Thank you very much. And here's the access to the website and the data for email contact with all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Sandra. Excellent presentation, very complete. We have foreseen schedule to close in 5 minutes. I would like to ask for your patience and ask you if it's possible to have 10 more minutes so that we can answer the questions here. We have some questions here in the chat. The first question has to do, the colleague has not identified himself or herself. Can you indicate the participation that industry has had in all the projects and work group that you have mentioned? How does PAHO see the role and participation of industry with regulatory agencies in the strengthening of regulatory systems in the region? Thank you so much for your question or your questions. I think we mentioned some of these points, but I would like to ask Sandra to respond from the perspective of the private sector. For instance, we have consulted the directing body documents and all the consultation documents. We always include the industry. Yes, it is true that, as Sandra mentioned, historically, we did not have formal recognition of association of industries of medical devices. There were some spaces that were limited. For instance, when we have the directing council meeting at PAHO or the executive committee at PAHO in June and the directing council in September. This year, in September, as we have every 5 years, we have the Pan American Sanitary Conference. So this is the directing council under a different name. And then, for instance, every 5 years, we have the election of the new director of PAHO. So in those official meetings and formal meetings, only those entities that are formally recognized by the organization can participate. And then, of course, they have to undergo a process of recognition. So since during the Pandora network, as was mentioned, this is the harmonization for pharmaceutical, the network for pharmaceutical product harmonization, and it has been in existence for several years. The pharmaceutical industry, Pharma and Alifarm, all of those have been recognized, have been for many years. And then we started this work with the coalition and we started the process, but then there's another procedure that we have to follow. First of all, we establish formal collaboration, and then after that, we go beyond that and we go to the recognition as an entity that has access and voice their concerns and opinions during the directing council. We have several spaces for dialogue, for consultations. We have for many years had this dialogue space. And then we have that very often. Sandra, could you please express your perspective on this? Yes, thank you, Alexandre. Yes, of course, we see increasing opportunities for collaboration. I think the initiative of the World Health Organization relates to the application of the good regulatory practices independently of the obligations of the country. But this helps to generate this new culture of collective development within the guidelines. At the present time, for instance, this week, we have reached the deadline for public consultation for the update of the global model of the regulatory framework that is on June the 3rd. As a coalition, we have submitted our comments, and then after that, you gave us the information that you shared with us. And so this is a consultation that will take place with the countries of Latin America. And we have been invited as a coalition to be expressing our opinion regarding this document.
We have had a chance to actively participate, and the documents are good regulatory practices and reliance. The active participation as regards each and every country, the interaction of the private sector, of the academy, of the organizations that develop the effort internationally, the national standards organizations together with the regulators in the initial working groups for the development and update of regulations is something that becomes incredibly important, especially once you have the proposals and the public consultation spaces and contribution spaces. This is something where we're co-responsible to benefit from. And we would like to emphasize as regards this co-responsibility. I'll be very candid. It is very easy to complain about what someone else does or doesn't do. But when we truly analyze what is our role in the final result, we find that perhaps we could have done more or much more in the different instances of these processes. There is something that is very important here in order to contribute to the development of these reliance relations. One has to do with transparency and guarantee of an ethical behavior by all participants in these processes. On the other hand, a true guarantee that the proposals that will be brought forward to the table will be based on norms and international standards. Why? Because this will allow to avoid biases that could seem to indicate the preference for certain things. So to the extent that we have a common recommendation by the World Health Organization, by a common demand by the World Commerce Organization, World Trade Organization, we will be working in a field of absolute transparency and confidence. Co-responsibility and transparency are basic. Thank you, Sandra, for your comments. So we have a couple of questions from Ruth Ospina. First question is in Spanish about the global benchmarking tool. Not with the version including medical devices. There's a version in Spanish which is published in the PAHO site, where it shows the global benchmarking tool. But the previous version, prior to the incorporation of these indicators and devices, as I said during my presentation, in a few weeks now, WHO will publish this new version of the GBT, which will be used in this pilot efforts, which I mentioned during my presentation. As soon as we have this new version incorporating the changes as a result of the feedback of the pilot sessions, we will directly start making the translation. It is true that most of the indicators indeed happen to be just the same. So those have been translated already. So that will mean that a lot of work will not have to be done. Only those new indicators, which are specific for medical devices, will have to be translated, or if there's a change in the actual description of the indicators so that they may be applied to these devices. So, of course, we will be hoping that this will be ready for translation purposes. There's another question from Ruth Ospina. Have you thought of a date for the future version of the GBT, including clinical research with medical devices, is the question. Once again, to make it clear, the version which appears on the page is the latest version, the one valid now for these pilot studies that WHO will be conducting. The first mention will have to do with Kenya. That version will be ready, but that is not the final version. Much work was made in response to a concrete question regarding clinical research. I know that there was a very broad discussion among members of the working group regarding to what extent some of the indicators could be used from the already existing tool, or to what extent they ought to be changed rather in order to reflect the specificities of the regulation of these devices. One of these topics under discussion was that of clinical research, because the wording that was used for the already existing indicators applied rather to medications, clinical trials, and some of the group members have requested some changes in the wording and the way in which these had been drafted in the indicators. So we came to a possible consensus, but as I said earlier, this version and hinging on the actual results that we have in Kenya or Cuba and other countries that will very surely offering themselves in order to carry out this pilot effort, we will very surely have to make adjustments to those indicators, or some of them. So this is not the final version, but rather the one which is in force at this point. and which is published under the WHO website. A question from Alfredo Paredes regarding certificates. No, we do not issue certificates in these meetings. This is not something that we do in our regional group. So these were the questions that we had here within the chat question and answer section. There seems that there's no question now under the chat, but please visit the chat because there are many comments, very many interesting remarks and links that were shared also by Pajo. And also to remind you that this session, and I should have said this earlier, but I think that there's indeed an automated message that this session is being recorded. It's being recorded. I hope that no one will object to its being recorded. And the link will be available to all participants. As soon as it is ready, we will forward it to you. And also the presentations and the files will be available on our website. And as Sandra told us, in the site of the coalition also. I'd like to share with you our agenda for tomorrow, just to remind you that our event continues on tomorrow. Today was only the first part of our meeting. And Nilda on the screen will be showing us before we close. I had asked for 10 minutes. We have gone through 8, so we still have 2 more. So this is the agenda we have for tomorrow. We will begin with the same schedule, 10 a.m. Eastern time, Washington time, and we'll have a session devoted to good practices and reliance. I will be making a brief presentation initially, but then what is more important still is that tomorrow we will be discussing and listening about the experience of regulatory authorities. There you see the names of those of us the ones that we have received as of now. We have no confirmation from DNM, COFEPRID, DGEMID. We have no confirmation, but for now, if you are connected, if there are any representatives of these 3 regulatory authorities, please let us know. Let us please confirm as soon as possible your participation. Otherwise, we will take it that your participation is not confirmed and we would remove it from the agenda. The way in which we built this agenda for our meetings and the case of the regional group, for those of us who are unfamiliar and whom are here for the first time, we have this regional group. We have a listserv, so a list of groups with which we had exchanges of information. Focal points of each one of the regulatory authorities that actually participate in our virtual or physical activities. It's an exchange group of regulatory authorities only. As we do in all the meetings for this group, we send information for comments, suggestions with regard to the agenda. And the names you see here on the screen are the ones we have received as of now. Of course, we also have our colleagues from the country offices in each one of the countries. I'd like to thank publicly my colleagues of the country offices who always give us their support, many of whom are participating in this session as well. And this support is tremendously important. Thank you so much for your participation. And this is the agenda for tomorrow for the purpose of our session. I ask you to please remind you that is still the open session during the morning, and that more than 240 participants, almost 250 we've had today, will come back tomorrow and join us in order to have a session with a larger space for exchanges to listen to many presentations with very concrete experience cases. It will be a very dynamic and interesting session, I'm sure. So I invite you to please come back. We will be waiting for you tomorrow. Sandra, do you have any final comment you would like to offer? Thank you, Alexandra, so very much. I thank the Pan American Health Organization once again for having invited us to participate and be in this opening and this collaboration and open and transparent dialogue, which we deem to be extremely productive. Truly, thank you so very much. Just a very brief ad spot I would like to put here. Practically the same presentation made by Marie regarding good regulatory practices. We have it available for you, translated into Spanish in the website of the coalition. It's translated there. We will present the reference when we upload the materials of this meeting. If you agree, we will refer to that presentation so that anyone who may want to have access to it in Spanish may do so. And that is the translation that WHO has reviewed, prepared together with the group of WHO to be published in Spanish. And I think that you could all benefit from that material as well. Thank you very much for allowing me to place this spot. And we are very hopeful to listen to regulators in the region telling us about how is it that they're applying the reliance, because we understand it is the actual path to be followed to better use the resources of all those involved with a view to expediting all the procedures as well as the availability of this possibility that has to do with the actual utilization of medical devices and any other input for that matter. Thank you so very much again for the invitation. We'll see you tomorrow. Excellent, wonderful. Thank you so very much once again. And I think it is indeed wonderful that we may have a very similar version already translated into Spanish of that text that contributes to the dissemination of this information throughout the region. Thank you so very much. We have just received a thank you from Mario Vega with a confirmation of the DNM through the chat. Our gratitude goes to them, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Again, I wish that you have an excellent afternoon, and for some of you it is still the morning, maybe in a different day. I will see you tomorrow. I would like to thank our whole team, all of you who have participated, of course, members of the coalition, Sandra, all other members of the Secretariat, and also those members of my team, and Neil Enriquez, who has contributed to the organization. Thank you, Nilda and Abraham, for all your collaboration. Of course, the service of our conference interpreters of the highest quality who help us in this information exchange in our region whenever we have this kind of sessions. So thank you so very much. May you have a wonderful day. We'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.